Chris here. Thank you so much for taking the time to download and listen to this week's show. As ever, if you like what we do, please give the show a like and a share. But if you love what we do, please consider becoming a Patreon, because it really does give the team a boost and also helps us to commission up-and-coming writers who we help every step of the way. Now this week we're welcoming back a previous guest, Chris Armstrong, who wrote a fantastic book called The Blue New Deal. If you've not already listened to that podcast, I suggest you go and do it. Now Chris is a professor in political theory at the Department of Politics and International Relations at the University of Southampton. And this time, Chris is back to discuss his new book, Global Justice and the Biodiversity Crisis, Conservation in the World of Inequality. Now, Chris is a fantastic and engaging guest, and what I love about Chris is, he shines a light on those areas of the environment movement that don't often get a look in. He did it with the oceans, with his last book, and this time he's talking about biodiversity, which is a topic not only close to my heart, but also a topic that we promote as best we can on the show. Topics for this week's show are the importance of highlighting parts of the environment movement that don't always get the spotlight, human history in relation to our impact on the planet, the importance of global justice when it comes to biodiversity, harmful policies versus good policies, and finally a discussion around pesticides and farming. I really enjoy the show, and again, thank you so much for taking the time to download and listen. And let's crack on. Chris, welcome back, mate. How you doing?
I'm very good. Nice to be back.
Yeah, good to see you, pal. Okay, Chris, so you were a guest that really highlighted the fact that the environment movement's laser focus on carbon reduction meant that we'd potentially taken our eye off, this is in your first book, A Blue New Planet, taken our eye off like the world's oceans. You have a new book out now, Chris. What's that one about?
So this one's all about the biodiversity crisis. Which I think is another issue that gets overshadowed a little bit by the climate crisis. Right? Yeah. So climate crisis is really, really important, and we focus on that. I don't want to detract from that at all, but I think it's strange sometimes how that colonizes the environmental space and stops people talking as much as they ought to about the biodiversity crisis, which is really important, and also I try and argue raises all these massive global justice challenges too.
Yeah, I was going to ask, is that sort of a theme with yourself? Do you look at more like the grey areas where the spotlight is not necessarily the brightest, but and sort of decide that that's what needs to be highlighted more?
I think I do. I mean, it's a bit of a kind of retrospective thing I think about after the fact. Thinking about my career, I think I'm a bit like a scout, right? I kind of look around for new things that people haven't talked about enough.
Yeah.
Sometimes when people have talked about things a lot, talking about them isn't as fun. You have to wade through all their positions. You have to describe all the views. I like finding a new thing or, relatively underexplored thing and bringing it to people's attention.
Yeah, excellent. You know what? I really appreciate that, because I think, I'm sort of someone that picks up on patterns and much like everyone else probably does. And I do find that carbon-focused climate books, there is a set pattern there. They're just saying it in a different way, aren't they? They're sort of bringing up the same ideas, but saying it in a different way, aren't they?
Yeah.
Yeah. Now, your first book, obviously, it was a grey area, and in many ways, it really is still a grey area from my experience regarding the world's oceans. Was there anything that you saw where it was brought simply by writing that book, the conversation was brought into, or oceans were brought into the conversation more? Was there any successes that you look back on and say, yeah, that was the point of the book?
Small successes, right? So I'm not too ambitious about what academics can achieve, but I think I helped to prompt some conversations or nudge some conversations along a bit. As an academic, I'm not so into talking to policymakers. I'm more comfortable talking to normal people, activists.
So you're not into making money, Chris? You're not into...
No. So one of the things I ended up doing, I did some talks for people like Extinction Rebellion, Writers Rebel, and the folks I ended up talking to most, who I'm still talking to regularly at Ocean Rebellion, and their mission really is to say, look, we've just got this complete black hole or blue hole, if you like, where we ought to be talking about the future of the ocean and we're just not. How can we it's not a mass movement like Extinction Rebellion. It's more they're a bunch of artists, creative people. They want to get ocean issues in the newspapers, in the media, on people's horizon. And they're great folk, so I'm kind of involved in them still. And I think that was probably the biggest practical kind of payoff, that connection I made.
Yeah, sure. I mean, just as a small victory, we definitely, or I personally, and us as a group, we do highlight the ocean. I genuinely believe, based on our podcast that we did with you, even though it's something that you know is there, I genuinely don't think we mentioned it prior to having you on the show. And
no, I don't think we hadn't done, no.
Yeah, we hadn't done yet. And, you know, as much as, hand on heart, we do forget on occasion, I also do remember on occasion to bring the oceans into the conversation where we can. So I suppose if that can be amplified on multiple levels and platforms, then it has been a victory for Yancey writing that book.
Yeah, fantastic. Yeah, I mean, it's the biggest, probably the biggest carbon sink. It's the biggest haven of biodiversity. It's got all these really important justice dimensions, the workers, you know. The ocean is at the center of everything, right? We're a blue planet, but it's weirdly ignored in many discussions.
Now, before we get stuck into the details, and I know you said you're someone who likes to sort of delve into the grey areas of the environment movement, but was anything in particular that inspired you to write the book?
I think there are two things that I really wanted to do. One was just to kind of tackle that relative neglect of the biodiversity crisis compared to the climate crisis, right? So I was really just puzzled by why we spent so much more attention on one thing than the other, given that they're both like really massive threats to our existence on the planet, you know, the huge environmental consequences of the biodiversity crisis too. So what's that about? That's just a mystery to me. So that's one puzzle. And then the other thing I wanted to achieve was all about the kind of global justice dimension. So when you talk about climate, we already have this climate justice discourse, right? Everyone knows what climate justice means. Everyone has a view about climate justice. We have kind of principles of climate justice. We have climate justice movement. Why don't we have that for biodiversity, right? Why don't we have biodiversity justice or biodiversity justice activists or a biodiversity justice movement? Where is that and what would that look like? So it was really a puzzle. It was really a puzzle about how the climate terrain had kind of developed in one way, really productively, produced loads of really important conversations about climate justice, but the same thing hadn't happened in the biodiversity case. So my initial kind of puzzle was why that was and how we might kind of start moving towards filling that gap.
Yeah. Now, it might be quite superficial of me, this, but when I read a book, if the introduction doesn't grab me, I find the rest of the book a hard slog. I really do, yeah. But what I did like about your book, Chris, it gives a history of like human history, in relation to the planet and our impact on it. Yeah. And, you know, you go all the way back, I'm just wondering, just to sort of give our audience a picture of what humans have potentially done to the Earth. Could you give us sort of a brief version of that, if you can remember? Because I found it really interesting just to see the impact that we've had.
Yeah. So if we're talking about biodiversity is all about the kind of the variation in the world, the complexity, the wonderful differences. And what humans have done is basically to kind of homogenize, simplify the natural world, right? And how does that happen? So obviously it's to do with capitalism, and it's also to do with colonialism. So, you know, think about a place like South America. So hugely biodiverse ecosystems in the Amazon and so on. And then, you know, you get 1492 and the years that follow, and you get the emergence of plantation economies, where basically economic interests, well, how do you make money out of a rainforest, right? Step one is get rid of that rainforest and let's do monocropping. Let's do kind of replace diverse ecosystems with cash cropping. So that's a kind of nutshell version of what humanity has done to the world as a whole, right? We've stripped out lots of differences that we have thought are not particularly useful to us, not particularly lucrative to us, and we've replaced them with, something like 10 food crops, 4 or 5 or 6 different animal species that we've kind of intensively bred and spread throughout the planet. There's this kind of amazing statistic. This is just about mammals, right? That I think in the introduction to the book I mentioned it, and it says this is a strange idea, but if you weighed all the mammals in the world, you find that almost a third of them by weight would be human beings now, right? We've just grown and grown and grown. Another third would be cattle, right? And another almost a third would be,
everything
all the
else.
other domesticated species like pigs and so on, and sheep. And then you've got 4% of mammal biomass, which is everything else that's not domesticated, right? So that's a really neat encapsulation of the way in which we've converted a very kind of complex, interdependent ecosystem into these really simplified, cash crop oriented ecosystems, if they even deserve that title.
The book is kind of framed around, how do we build kind of a new vision of what biodiversity is, and where do we sit as humanity kind of in that mixture of other species. In terms of like what the conversation is globally right now, what is kind of the framework that's currently being used? I know biodiversity gets its own mission at COP every other year. What are they focusing on, and why isn't it the most ideal version of what we should be doing?
So in terms of the institutions, I mean, you have for climate, you've got the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. In the same year, 1992, you get the Convention on Biological Diversity. So we've been thinking about these problems and trying to regulate them for a really long time. In the climate case, you've got this scientific body that collects all of our kind of scientific wisdom about the climate, the IPCC. And then in the biodiversity case, a bit more recently, you've got this thing called IPBES, which is the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. Snappily titled, right? What's wrong with it? I mean, I think, people who work for IPBES no doubt have the best of intentions and maybe would reject this as a bit broad. But I think the last 2 words that I just said in the IPBES title are really instructive: ecosystem services, right? So there is a way of looking at the world of nature, the world of biodiversity, that assumes it kind of exists to provide services for us. Right. And so how do we measure how important those services are? Well, we convert that into pounds and pence, right? So
dollars.
What are the contributions of different bits of biodiversity to our economy? And in some ways that's useful, right? You can tell people who care about the economy that, no biodiversity, no economy, clearly. But it's a very limited perspective.
It's kind of focused on, I feel like when that focus is like, well, obviously the issue is lack of investment. So how do we deal with that is by categorizing it in a way where it's about money. And so you can go, well, we put this many pounds into this pocket of rainforest in Indonesia. And we'll get this many pounds back out of biodiversity. Which is, I suppose, to your point, isn't really the point of the whole thing. Like we shouldn't be able to distill this kind of complexity into numerical value, even if it does help us in a way to categorize it as for it to be understandable.
So a really good example of that, I think you had Adrienne Buller on your...
I was going to say, it reminds me very, very much of what she breaks down. So yes, carry on, mate.
Yeah, the value of a whale, right? So what is the value of a whale? So of course, if you put a price on carbon, if you're an economist, you can then think, well, how much carbon is there in a whale? How much carbon does a whale manage to suck out of the ecosystem and, sequester, if you want? And and you get an answer, whatever I don't remember from Adrian's book what the answer is. Maybe a whale is worth $10 million for all I know, but that's kind of interesting, but it's clearly not the whole picture, right? You also want to say that the whale has intrinsic value. A whale is a wonderful creature. The whale doesn't just provide for us the service of locking away carbon. A whale is also something that is wonderful, beautiful, that shares the world with us, has its own rights potentially. So there's all kinds of ways in which we might respond to the biodiversity crisis that just don't get captured in that economic logic, I think.
Yeah. And yet it is, within itself, as you just hit the nail on the head, it has its own logic, but you have to look outside of the parameters of that logic, which capitalists and this system seems very unable to do. And even things like, there's parts of the ecosystem we know nothing about. Even animals that we feel that we know most about, there's still probably things we don't know about them that will add to an ecosystem that we've yet to discover, and that's amplified on thousands of species. We have no idea of the intricacies of any animal, insect, plant, and how it connects to the natural world. So this idea that we even know the value of anything is kind of insane to me. But you know what, I'm glad you mentioned Adrian there, because that was a fantastic book, and she was a fantastic guest as well. So that's a fantastic connection there. Now your book talks about biodiversity and global justice, which I think is fairly unique. Where's your connections there? What are you trying to get at there, Chris?
Okay, so the way I put it in the book is, I think there are three reasons why, when we talk about biodiversity, we always ought to talk about global justice. Or if you want to put it the other way around, if we care about global justice, we ought to care about biodiversity, right? So there's three connections. One of them is that when you look at the drivers of biodiversity loss, you can't ignore socioeconomic inequalities, right? So lots of places in the world where biodiversity is being destroyed, that's down to poverty, it's down to inequality. We've got lots and lots of statistical evidence that more unequal societies are more likely to destroy biodiversity or destroy biodiversity faster. We know that when biodiversity gets destroyed in one part of the world, that's often connected to kind of global value chains, right? So there's an example I give, which is the Mexican spider monkey, which we might in the West or in the global North, if you like, think this is terrible. The Mexican spider monkey is endangered. It might go extinct. We might say Mexico ought to do a better job of protecting that species of monkey. But actually, it looks as though the main reason that species is endangered is because of the high-end coffee trade, right, which is oriented towards consumers in the North. So that's the first reason, right? If we are going to tackle the biodiversity crisis, we have to keep in view the impact of inequality, the impact of poverty, the impact of our affluence, right, which often drives these processes. Second reason is that, so the reverse thing is also true, which is that biodiversity loss creates more injustice, right? So a neat way of saying that is probably just to say that although biodiversity, much like climate, although the loss of biodiversity will impact on all of us, it will especially heavily impact the most vulnerable.
Yeah, it's not equal impact.
So if you're living in a kind of subsistence economy, where maybe when times are hard, you might forage in the wild for additional, food, or you might rely on, natural medicines, and biodiversity is lost, you really have a problem, right? Consumers in the global North can just kind of switch to different products, but people who are
or get the same thing from somewhere else in the world in a different supply chain.
So biodiversity loss doesn't impact evenly, right? It intensifies existing kind of inequalities in the way that climate does. And then the final thing, which in some ways is the biggie, is that our responses to biodiversity loss if they are not managed properly, can really intensify injustice or even create new injustices. And this is the thing that I think I learned the most about in writing the book. That was the biggest eye opener, and is kind of horrifying, stroke terrifying. So the way in which conservation policy has just been really exclusionary, regressive. There is this model of work that's called fortress conservation, which says something like, well, you the local people are a threat to biodiversity, so we need to move you to one side, and then we can have a reserve. We can protect biodiversity, and that's frequently been coercive, violent, and it has often also meant that the people who aren't really threats to biodiversity have been blamed, right, and have become victims of these really exclusionary policies. So there's a whole series of reasons, I think, why we need to think about biodiversity and global justice together.
Now, just by pure coincidence, Chris, we also commission articles, and our latest article is by a fantastic American activist called Andrew Ahern. I don't know if you know Andrew at all. He's kind of a rising star, maybe in more the degrowth movement. But he wrote for us regarding biodiversity jobs guarantee, which again, it was very similar to me. It was like when I read that, I thought, wow, why has nobody thought about a biodiversity jobs guarantee in regards to an actual policy, a state policy? And he connects it to a number of things. For example, he talks about, I think it's something, I can't remember the percentage, but a hell of a lot of people feel like they work in what's typically known as bullshit jobs, and it's finding value in work. It's part of a just transition for when we phase out and dismantle fossil fuels. It allows people to have jobs outside of that. But he also, as well, which I think you sort of touched on there with the global justice part, he's writing almost from an American perspective, even though it translates quite well for England, maybe not this particular part, but he also highlights the importance of indigenous communities leading these sorts of programs. And it sounds like you would echo that as well, yeah?
Yeah, completely. So I don't, in the book, want to knock the kind of conservation industry, but it does have its peculiarities, right? So on the big global scale, one of the really striking things is that we were just talking about protected areas. If you look at protected areas in many countries in Africa, for example, also many countries in Asia, they actually replicate colonial era game reserves, right? They have the same geographical footprint as game reserves, which are set up by colonizers, excluding.
Why?
Well, let's designate this place somewhere where we're going to protect the lions bracket so we can shoot them, protect the rhinos, and so on. And that means that we need to exclude and limit the rights of indigenous people, local people who've maybe lived there for generations. And the really striking thing is that in the period of decolonization, when new governments come to power that actually represent people in, Kenya or Tanzania, rather than thinking about conservation from scratch, they stick with those existing boundaries, right? In many cases, so they just inherit. They inherit the lines on the map, and they say, right, well, we're not going to call this a game reserve anymore. We're going to call it a protected area. But in many cases, they still continue excluding the same kind of indigenous tribes people. They have the same conflicts with those people about access to territory and the right to hunt or the right to forage. And that was really striking to me. So that's one of the kind of interesting power dynamics that is still present in contemporary conservation. Another one would be the whole kind of epistemic question. So who gets counted as a knower of biodiversity, right? Whose knowledge about biodiversity counts? And generally speaking, in the conservation industry, for all that it has achieved a lot in many cases, it's dominated by Western scientists. is
academics.
Yeah, academics, often from, a relatively select bunch of universities who are overwhelmingly white and also historically overwhelmingly male, who've got to define what knowledge about conservation and success in conservation looks like.
Yeah.
Sometimes it actually turns out that they are parasitic on forms of indigenous knowledge that they just don't really properly acknowledge.
Yeah.
Or even know.
Or
so
even
some of them are acting in good faith, but don't actually realise the source of their own learning.
Yeah, exactly. And so, something I quote in the conclusion to the book is there's this one conservation scholar comes up with a fantastic question, which is, who are the people we think of when we think about conservation in Africa? They're not Africans, or at least they're not black Africans, right?
Yeah.
They are the kind of, the Diane Fosseys of the world and so on, who may well have contributed to the cause of conservation, but it's regrettable, to say the least, that the conservationists working in Africa who we can most readily call to mind are white Westerners, right? So all of those injustices that are internal to the conservation industry are now being put really center stage in debates about what the future of conservation should look like. They're long overdue, I think, right? So
yeah,
totally,
definitely.
Because even like, I know, just watching BBC documentaries about conservation, it's David Attenborough, who famously traveled around the world and did videos in the 50s and 60s of things that were probably now relatively distasteful,
right?
And it's always some broad voice Scotsman doing a voiceover about cattle in like sub-Saharan Africa. He's never really anyone that's local to that project. That's not to say that he should have someone, like, you don't always need someone from that area to talk about that thing, but if the predominant voice is always someone from Britain who went to Eton, it really changes the perspective of the information that's going to come in to that conversation as well.
And I think, I don't know if it's useful to keep hammering away at that contrast with climate, but within the debate about climate justice, one thing that has already happened is this question of who speaks for the climate justice movement, right? That conversation has happened, and people are trying to, if you like, kind of decolonize those conversations. I think exactly the same thing is starting in the conservation case.
Yeah, I suppose though, like there's a kind of historical precedent of there being a British man who cares about animals that is like embedded in the psyche of people here. That there's a kind of almost like the Dr. Dolittle type. That goes out and travels around the world and sees everything and comes back and tells you why we should be looking after things. But then I suppose the modern equivalent of that is that same person, but then they will be attached to a hedge fund.
Right.
And they will kind of tell you, well, the value of this whale or chinchilla is X and could be that to you. In the middle of the book, you kind of talk about trying to, what we're talking about here is like trying to define what I can't even say it now, conservation is, and how it needs to adapt to, the situation now where we're kind of finding ourselves and running out of time in terms of climate change. And a term that I've always been drawn to is the idea of like stewardship of the earth. And in English history previously, we used to have basically forest wardens, who were local people that had to look after resources and the wildlife to make sure it was there for the other peasants. How does I can't say the word? How does conservation have to adapt to meet today's challenges and risks?
So I think the idea of stewardship is really interesting to think about here. So we've been talking a bit about protected areas and the kind of the extreme version of that, the fortress conservation model that says somebody, probably a white person, gets to draw lines on a map and locals get excluded, dispossessed, because there are scientific experts who know how things should run. And the fight back against that, part of the fight back against that is to look seriously at what happens in indigenous managed areas. Right? So you have to be kind of careful in this conversation, because indigenous communities don't necessarily think of themselves as conserving biodiversity, right? They might not necessarily work with the concept of biodiversity. They might not think about humans as separate from nature at all. They might have a worldview in which we're all in this together. We have this kind of very integrated, holistic view about the world. But in practice, it seems that when indigenous peoples' rights to land are respected, the conservation outcomes can be extremely positive. So there have been some really, really interesting and I think encouraging studies recently that say that, if you compare the conservation outcomes of conventional protected areas with the conservation outcomes of indigenous and local managed areas, there's nothing to choose between them, right? So our preference for the protected area on the kind of fortress conservation model, maybe it just serves certain interests, right? Maybe it's maybe there's a career path, maybe there are economic interests, maybe the local state prefers the idea of kind of working with an international NGO rather than local communities. But actually it looks as though that kind of eternally unfinished job of respecting the land claims of indigenous people, it might be, if we could finally complete that project, it might be just about the most kind of pro-biodiversity thing we could do.
Because there's a part of me that, maybe it's kind of a slight, anti-human stance that comes out of me in a cynicism sometimes, where I'm like, well, the best thing to do would be to, take a swath of land and leave it alone. And you kind of come onto this at the back end of the book when you talk about, half Earth and beyond. And is kind of that thought kind of more of a reactionary stance than actually anything that's based in fact, in comparison to your work?
Yeah. So, one kind of theme that comes and goes in the book a bit is the idea of wilderness. And it's a really controversial idea in conservation circles. So we talked about the US just now, but one of the things the kind of founding fathers of the conservation movement in the US clearly thought they were doing was preserving wilderness, which is the idea of a landscape that isn't spoiled by human beings at all.
Yeah.
But what we now know, what historians have shown us, is that they were creating wilderness. They weren't protecting wilderness, because the spaces like, Yellowstone, for example, were always inhabited by human beings. And there was a fairly kind of peaceful, sustainable relationship with those ecosystems. But what the creators of places like Yellowstone National Park wanted was a kind of pristine, untouched place. And so they excluded, Native Americans, indigenous populations, so that they could have these depopulated landscapes that fit the kind of model that they had in their mind of the
This is kind of like the other side of that. I think we discussed last time about this kind of idea of terra nullius.
Yes.
And, there being nothing there, so we can claim to do what we want with it.
Yeah.
So it's like, we will say there is nothing there, so we can demand that we do nothing with it.
Right. And there's been some, I'm not an expert on this by any means, but there's been some really interesting work done on things like the Amazon rainforest. So we think of the Amazon rainforest as the kind of stereotypically unspoiled, intact, natural ecosystem.
Yeah.
But I think, ecological historians are now casting doubt on that and asking whether what the Amazon looks like now is not in fact the result of thousands of years of kind of human stewardship and interaction with the Amazon, right? The state that it has now might be the product of kind of human relationships with nature. In which case, there's an alternative model there of humans living with nature in a pretty harmonious way.
Yeah.
Totally.
Chris, we did mention there about sort of half Earth being in the book, but so there's a couple of proposals that you don't necessarily rate. I think biodiversity offsetting is one, which doesn't fucking surprise me.
Yeah.
But, let's just take maybe the worst one that you've heard about, and say this is a proposal what we need to swerve, and what some in our audience either have heard of or potentially going to hear of. So just tell them right now that's the one you swerve. But then also you do have some proposals yourself, so let's delve into that after it. Let's get onto some good stuff and some real proposals.
So In terms of what we should swerve, I mean, I think half Earth is a really good example. So I think initially, okay, so the basic half Earth idea is, look, we're destroying biodiversity at a frenzied rate. What's the end game? How do we get out of this? What's the exit ramp from biodiversity destruction? Basically, we need to differentiate a human half of the world from the other half of the world, which we leave for nature or biodiversity. And, you know, that's not literally kind of two hemispheres, but it's the idea is we have protected areas in biodiversity hotspots that should add up to about half of the Earth, the land and the sea. And that way we might protect most species, we might get out of the biodiversity crisis. Now, I think when I read that, so it has ambition, right? In some ways, we know that we are not succeeding in, you know, mitigating the biodiversity crisis. We are not dealing with the biodiversity crisis. What we do need is ambition. What we do need is kind of transformative policies, and this is an ambitious transformative policy. But then the more I thought about it, and the more I read the detail of the proposals and read between the lines of the proposals, the more uneasy I got. And the reason essentially is because it seems to essentially reinvent that kind of traditional exclusionary fortress conservation model, right? So the idea of having half of the Earth which is protected from humans seems to suggest that humans ought to be kind of excluded from that half. But of course, the parts of the world where biodiversity is pretty much intact are the parts of the world that are inhabited by indigenous communities. So is the half Earth proposal a proposal to exclude indigenous people from their traditional homelands? And it seems that people who defend half Earth are just kind of cagey about this. Right? It seems as though the answer to that question is not anything like as clear as it could be. But I think the logic of their position seems to be, well, nature's half, humans half. It looks like a recipe for exclusion. So that's, I think, a proposal that we ought to swerve. So what's great about it is that it's ambitious, but it seems to be blind to all the huge moral costs that might be involved in that. So exclusion and marginalization, but also it puts the cost of dealing with the biodiversity crisis on the shoulders of the people who did not create the biodiversity crisis, right? In a sense, indigenous communities have been the ones who have been successful at conserving biodiversity, and they are now going to be punished by being excluded from their homelands. Right? So, okay, so how do we do better? So towards the end of the book, I say we probably ought to do two kinds of things. So one of them I've already mentioned, which is we ought to take much more seriously indigenous land claims, because though they are the people who've proven successful at conserving biodiversity, not us. So maybe respecting their rights and giving them more autonomy over the regions in which they live might be, you know, a terrific pro-biodiversity policy, as well as advancing goals of social justice, right? Historical rectification and all of that. So that's one part of it. But then the other part of it, I think, is to go global and to put global forces back in view. So one of the problems of the fortress conservation model is it acts as though the problem when we face the biodiversity crisis is that locals are cutting down trees, locals are consuming resources, locals are destroying mangrove swamps, and so on. And often that's the case, you know, maybe that is the case, but they're doing that in a global context. And there are global value chains. And often at the end of those global value chains are people like you and I, right? Consumers in the global north who are incentivizing forms of biodiversity loss. Sometimes these local communities are facing kind of tragic choices. They might be indebted, they might be trapped in poverty. So I think if we're really going to stop biodiversity loss, we can't pretend that global context isn't there, right? This kind of circles back to the idea of making our response to the global biodiversity crisis a response which is about inequality, right?
Yes. Yeah.
So it might mean degrowth. It might mean thinking about the impact of northern kind of overconsumption. It might mean tackling global inequalities. It might mean writing off the debts of countries in the global south, which often, as I say, indebtedness often drives things like deforestation, it turns out. So it's about putting all those global forces back in the picture.
I think we've seen in the news last week kind of those global forces of indebtedness are still running rife. It was in Kenya this week where basically there was been huge protests and riots over a proposed set of taxes coming in to deal Kenya, basically with their IMF debt.
Right.
And then the people have said no, and the government's had to kind of roll back on that.
Well, actually, Andrew, I was going to link into that. Actually, that's similar to what I was going to say. So surely a part of this restructuring, let's call it, for want of a better word, is giving developing countries funds to diversify their economies. If we are going to say that an economy is still going to be an important part of the future, obviously, like for people like myself, I want to scale back an economy and sort of explore different ways of flourishing as human beings.
Yeah.
But let's just say within this system, because as you've already touched on there, we've had hundreds, if not thousands of years of colonialism, which has set up trade routes from developing nations to Western nations along literally 5-6 products, that then countries are now having to rely on.
Yeah.
And their survival is almost based on our consumption of these consumer products.
Yeah.
So surely a part of this as well is funding nations. You've already mentioned about debt, cancelling debt, which I think is really important because it allows them then to spend money on different things, but also giving them money, diversify their economy, make their economies more stable from a planetary and living world point of view. Yeah. Things like, I don't know, like a biodiversity job guarantee, this sort of thinking.
Yes.
Because otherwise they're still going to be trapped in these historical trade routes, aren't they?
Yeah, absolutely. So, we can't just assume that people in the global south are destroying biodiversity because they don't like biodiversity, right? They're occupying a really difficult structural situation. They often have really few choices. There are often problems of indebtedness. There's often things like capital flight, illegal financial flows that starve local governments of resources. And they're often, as you say, inhabiting economies. They've been steered towards the production of certain cash crops by international lenders and so on. So we can't, from the outside, just lecture these communities about their responsibilities. We can't just lecture them and say, you need to protect biodiversity.
Yeah.
If we don't help to share with them the costs of protecting biodiversity, we're basically free riding on those efforts.
Totally, yeah.
So I completely agree with you. A big part of it has to be, well, if we don't want poor communities to engage in activities that are destructive towards biodiversity, what other options are we going to open up for them? Right? So it's completely about diversification. I think a big part of the story is about what alternative economic futures are going to be open towards these for these communities. If it's not going to be the destruction of biodiversity, what is it?
Yeah.
No, I think we've kind of spoke about this throughout the conversation, Chris, about rejecting the idea that humanity shouldn't have a relationship with the other species of the planet, and we should be kind of a more I suppose integrated or at least respectful relationship between ourselves and other species. What does that look like to you? Like what are the stepping stones in that direction? Is it a case of okay, do we have to kind of start bringing instead of doing that fortress conservation, do we have to start bringing the conservation back to where we live and try and building habitats as part of our built environment in cities and towns? How do you imagine we kind of move towards that?
I think that is really important. So we might be kind of tempted by a model that says something like most biodiversity is in the global south, so let's do conservation in the global south. And some economists say, well, the global south is a place where it's cheap to do conservation because incomes are lower. You have to compensate people less when you oblige them to engage in conservation. So it's more efficient to conserve in the global south. And you could end up with a picture where the global south leaves its biodiversity intact and communities in the global north just go on destroying their biodiversity. And one problem with that is that biodiversity is important to all of us, right? So as you just said, it ought to be something we all have the ability to engage with. So I think one of the times this really kind of percolated up into the public consciousness, or the consciousness at least of academics and activists, was during the pandemic, where in the pandemic, when our movements were quite tightly controlled, we had to stay at home, it really became obvious that we have very unequal access to biodiversity in our everyday lives, in our communities. So, you live in a big house with a big garden, being told to stay at home might still allow you to engage with nature. You live in a city, in an apartment, and being told that you can't leave home means you're not going to have any engagement with biodiversity. So it revealed these inequalities in access to biodiversity. And I think we can't be happy with a picture in which we protect biodiversity over there, whatever over there means, and we go on destroying it closer to home. And one of the reasons for that is just because we just have a human interest in engaging with a diverse natural world. It's part of what a good life includes, I think.
I'd agree with you. I'd agree. Just to kind of keep it on a UK footing for a moment. I work in local government, and biodiversity net gain is like the big thing that's come into planning law recently. And everyone's freaking out about it because there's no money to do this very big thing. How do kind of frameworks like that fit into what you're talking about? For the people that don't know, biodiversity net gain is when you want to build a new house, you have to kind of see what biodiversity was there before you built it, and then I think it's make 10 times of that. Are they in the area where it's going to get built, or in a new place somewhere else? So it's still kind of very much a way of defining very much a set idea of what biodiversity is. Like how does that sit with you, Chris?
So we're in the kind of ballpark of biodiversity offsetting. So biodiversity offsetting basically says, as you just said, you can destroy biodiversity here so long as you create some more there, or create even more there. There might be a kind of multiplier. And this was one of the other main topics that I really did not know much about when I started writing the book, but the more I read about it, the more horrified I was. Right. So it seems that there's a way of conceptualizing biodiversity that is hardwired into biodiversity offsetting policies that I think is deeply unhealthy and deeply unhelpful. So basically it assumes that there are something like units of biodiversity. We could talk till the cows come home about how we would measure that, but basically we can talk about biodiversity equivalents. So, I cut down some woodland here, but you produce, 10 units of grassland over there. That gets us to be equivalent. The developer gets the green light. What it neglects? Well, it neglects a couple of things. One thing it neglects is that people actually have relationships with particular bits of biodiversity, right? I might care about biodiversity in general, but I might also care about the woods at the back of my house. And if someone destroys the woods at the back of my house and says, nevertheless, we planted another woodland 20 miles away, it's not much consolation to me because I care about that place, right? So there's a kind of an intimate connection, obviously, often that we have with particular bits of biodiversity, and biodiversity offsetting just can't engage with that, as far as I can tell.
No, certainly not. It's just like different units. It's just economics again. It's economics kind of dressed in the ideas of conservation.
Yes. So that's one problem. The other problem is to do with animals. So this takes us down a particular route. But one thing you're doing, if you are giving the green light to biodiversity offsetting, is you are saying it's okay to harm or kill animals in one location, so long as you give animals the opportunity to come into being in some other location. Right? And sometimes I think it pays just to be really clear about that, putting that assumption clearly on the table. Some people might think that's okay, right?
A lot of people think that's okay.
Yeah, a lot of people seem to think that's okay. And maybe even some political theorists, utilitarians might think that's okay. It's numbers that count, right? I don't think that's okay, because I think we have to take seriously the idea that individual animals actually have rights, which might include the right not to just be killed for no good reason. So biodiversity offsetting licenses that kind of destruction in a way that I find really morally problematic, basically.
Gotcha.
It allows harm. It allows harm to be produced, so long as, some other flora and fauna gets an opportunity to emerge somewhere else. There's another kind of equivalence that I think is really problematic.
I'd add to this as well. Sorry, Andrew. Do you have?
I was going to say, I suppose if we're going to be equivalent about it, if we were to say the same about people, I think we would be fucking outraged if you went, all right, we're going to kill 30 people in Oldham, but don't worry, there's going to be 30 more people that are going to live in upstate New York that are going to get to go to Yale.
That's a great point.
Don't worry about it.
People would not accept that. So basically, if we accept it in the case of animals, it's just because we are not taking their interests seriously. We're not taking the fact that they have a right to life. They might be attached themselves to particular places. They might have families. We're not taking any of that stuff seriously. We're treating them as kind of interchangeable units.
I would add to it as well that it's going back to we don't actually know fundamentally the intrinsic value of ecosystems that we destroy. We don't know enough about them. We just don't. And also as well, and we've had guests on before who have been experts in sort of forest management and the pitfalls of that. Now, you're not going to recreate what nature has decided is in a certain place. You're not going to recreate that in a different place in the same way. There's also, you're not going to have the funds to manage it because a lot of these projects, they get planted, the theory's all there, but then it gets left to its own devices, and a large percentage of them fail because it isn't the right species, it isn't the right place. There's loads of little things going on, and the vast majority of these projects they just fail. They just fail, and we don't put enough money into the management side of it. So there's that as well.
I think that's important.
But it's also this idea that you're going to bring into being animals in a different area. Now, a different area might have different animals. There's so many levels to this. That it just don't wash for me. But it's also, which you find with carbon offsetting, there's now been research. There's that many companies claiming that they're carbon offsetting. That when you look into the amount of land that they're claiming to be actually planting trees, there's not enough land. There's not enough viable, arable land that you can plant on. And the bigger that this biodiversity offsetting becomes, you're going to have exactly the same. And also, as well, it's very hard to quantify as well. You're not going to measure it with, right, that was, 4 meters by 8 meters, so I'm going to plant 4. It just doesn't quantify. I know you said before that you thought that the half Earth theory was the one we should be swerving. But for me, I think this offsetting shit is just poison. It's corporate poison. That sounds so reasonable. The common man in the street, it sounds so reasonable. Carbon offsetting and flying a plane. Don't worry, it's a percentage carbon. Everything's carbon. Don't worry, everything's in balance. It's just it sounds great to people that don't even want to think about it. Or want just to justify their own actions. And that's the danger of me. I find it so toxic, that shit.
So one thing I think is really important you've touched on is, to get to kind of political economy, it looks like one thing that biodiversity offsetting allows is it allows states to just absolve themselves of the responsibility to engage in conservation, give that responsibility to corporations, and we know what happens, right?
Yeah,
there's no accountability.
That's the end. That's the end of the environment.
Right. Corporations come and go. They make commitments, but then they get bought out or they go bust or...
Nobody's monitoring it. We haven't got enough government officials to monitor any of it.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Who's going to monitor it? Yeah. 1,000 companies all offsetting. We're going to have a government official every week doing his calculations. He wants all the graphs. It's not happening. No. It's not happening. It's all based on promises. It's all based on don't worry about it. We've got people looking into it.
Yeah, it's based on the good chaps theory of politics. Is that I am honest and you're honest, so everything will be fine.
Yeah.
It's never the case.
So Chris, I'm interested in things like, and I know it can be a bit simplistic, but I'm after some quick fixes here. So I'm after some quick fixes.
Have you got some seeds in your pocket, Chris?
Yeah, on a local level, Chris. Right. For example, I'm going through some at the moment. I've been fighting my council for years to phase out pesticides. Yeah, I thought I'd won that battle. It turns out I didn't because I left Labour, and all of a sudden it's all been forgotten. So I'm sort of refighting a battle that I thought I won 3 years ago. But things like pesticides, would the banning of pesticides, in your view and your research, is that something that would be a massive boost if it was done tomorrow? Is that do we have solutions that are so quick and with such benefits, or are we all just being naive to think that there is? Is there any? Is pesticides one of them?
Yeah. So if you look at the big drivers of biodiversity loss, obviously you've got things like climate change, which contributes to biodiversity loss. But the big story is industrial agriculture, and the particular practices that industrial agriculture engages in, and things like pesticides are going to be a big part of that, right? It's not a coincidence that they destroy biodiversity. That's what it says on the tin, right? Pesticides destroy biodiversity. So often that means that you destroy pollinators as well as pests, right?
It's very much, Chris, it's very much like the first Gulf War, where we were told that they had these Star Wars missiles that, don't worry, because these missiles, they're pinpointed, they only kill the bad guys, and everyone sat in front of the telly and went, ooh, look at that, an explosion, but don't worry, these are laser-guided, super futuristic missiles that only kill the bad guys. Yeah. It's kind of that sort of bullshit, isn't it, when really it's just a nuclear bomb going off, killing everything.
Yeah, I mean the thing that gets my goat is that there was this. We might have to chase up the details later, but there was this rule that I think initially came from the EU that said, let's ban neonicotinoids. Is that right? And because they're catastrophic for bees. But you can apply for an exemption in really exceptional circumstances. And guess what? Every year there are exceptional circumstances.
Of course there are.
And permission is given to carry on using them, even though we know what the impact is going to be. So there is a fight with certain sections of the big agriculture lobby that is just unavoidable, I think, if you want to take biodiversity seriously.
What pesticides have got to go?
Yeah, well, I mean, maybe some have different kinds of effects, but as far as we know, I mean, this goes back to Rachel Carson and Silent Spring, right? She was telling us about this, 50, 60 years ago. We are headed in a really, really scary direction.
Like that kind of, that conversation about pesticides and herbicides does kind of lead us to an area which there's not much concentration on, which there's been lots of, politics and anger about, which is farming and farmers and their lives they're leading right now, and the struggles they're having as running businesses and trying to supply food to the UK and in Europe as well. There's big farmers riots is a collective noun for a set of farmers. I don't know. People throwing slurry on people and like the houses of parliament and whatnot. Like there's all that going on, which is fundamentally connected to this conversation we're having. About how we use land to support food development and crops and agriculture without diminishing biodiversity as much as possible at the same time. And I feel like how this gets presented in the news is that, the farmers are all really pissed off. No one knows why.
Right.
like I feel like it's something we have to really tackle and bring this conversation that we're having today to those people as well. Because as much as, I grew up in the countryside, as much as, big, agribusiness and big farming is like a hegemonic, like concrete tower that won't have much to say about these things that aren't about profit. There are also plenty of people that are farmers that have been doing it for generations, that it's kind of part of their livelihood, and they have an understanding with the earth, or they have one that they think they have, and will see themselves in that stewardship role in terms of, if they're cutting hedgerows or not doing that, and have a closer understanding to nature in a way that maybe many of us who live in cities have no idea whatsoever about. So I think we need to bring those two together.
I think, though, Andrew, that can be slightly romanticised, because I remember reading a book by a farmer called James Rybank, who Chris might know, yourself might know, and he talks about farming through his own generation, so his father and his grandfather. So James Rybank is about 50 years old, and the change of the scale and the type of farming today from his father's and especially his grandfather's generation, it's only like 2 generations, is unrecognisable. This romanticised version of the man tilling the land with, listen, this is what he's saying.
I totally take your point, actually. But I feel like at the same time, if we're going to be trying to find allies in this cause, maybe the people that think of themselves as stewards of the land would be a place to be having this conversation as well.
Yeah, it's just that I don't know if they consider themselves stewards anymore. I think the way that the economy and farming has developed in the last 50 years, it's been pressure put more on profit than it has on stewardship. And I think modern farmers, if they were to, ask themselves a question, are you a steward, or are you actually in a race against time to try and actually make some money out of a job that's been in your family for generations? I think that those scales have tipped massively. And I think what they're actually wanting, they may not have expressed it and I don't want to sound passionate, but I think they want, like everybody, they want to find value and worth in the work that they're doing. And I don't think they want it to be about money. I do believe that they probably do want it to be about stewardship. And I think maybe we have to have the conversations about how can we create a food system where stewardship becomes the primary function of farmers. And those are the conversations that I believe that they actually want as well. But listen, I'm not an expert. I've read a couple of books. James Rybank, I would suggest people go and follow him. He does speak about this with obviously a lot more expertise than me. I've read his book. But yeah, you're right though. These conversations need to be had and allies need to be made. But I think maybe the angle of the conversation maybe what's important.
Yeah, totally. Chris, do you have any final thoughts about how farmers fit into this conversation?
Yes, well, I mean, it just reminds me of what we were talking about much earlier, which is, there are many people in the global south who are at the kind of hard edge of biodiversity destruction because they find themselves in such a difficult structural situation, not because they don't care about biodiversity, because they don't care about nature, but because they have very few options and they are being squeezed, right? And we shouldn't imagine that is just something that's only happening in the global south, right? We also, as you've been saying, need to recognize that that's something that's happening throughout the world, right? This is something that we need to take really seriously. And how can there be the economic space to take stewardship responsibility seriously. I think that's a really big challenge.
Yeah,
totally. And I think as well, there is a lot of people that believe that this is the way that it is and this is the way that it's going to be. And it's almost about having the confidence to reimagine a different system, which I just think is lacking in society overall. We do not talk about different systems. We just accept the reality that's in front of us and try and work within it the best that we can so we can put some food on the bloody table. But I'd love to have conversations with farmers and say, just imagine a different system. What system would you want if you could have anything? Those conversations, I just don't think they're being had. I just think the fear of having your house taken off you, the fear of not being able to afford your cattle that you've always had in the family, the fear of depreciating costs of milk and these sorts of things because of mass industrial supermarkets that are squeezing the markets and subsidies and all this. I think it's just not giving them the space and the time to say, do you know what? Let's have a talk about a different system. And I'd love to have those conversations. I probably won't be the person to them, but I hope they're going on somewhere with some, with the farmers front and center. Andrew, you are right; they have to be front and center. But let's ask them a different question.
Yeah. Well, we'll get them on the show. If you're a farmer listening, please get in contact. I hope you are.
If you're a farmer that dreams about a different system,
if you're an eco-socialist farmer who's not in rural China.
Chris, Chris, thank you so much, mate. It's great to see you again.
Yeah.
Listen, you're doing important work. You're covering those areas where the spotlight is not shining its brightest, and I really appreciate that, pal. Listen, biodiversity is close to my heart. We do bring it up on the show. We're going to continue talking about oceans, pal. Again, thank you so much for your time tonight, mate.
Great. Good to talk.
Okay, well, this is the part of the show that's dedicated to the fighters, the healers, and the conservers of the world that are doing their bit for all of us. It's the shout out. Chris, who have you got for us this week, mate?
I thought I would mention an NGO who've been around for decades, Survival International, who are campaigning to protect Indigenous people who are facing threats of eviction from the land, exclusion in the name of conservation. Recently, actually, they put a book out which has got a great title, which is called Decolonize Conservation 2023, which I hadn't read when I wrote the book, but I wish I had. But what's really good about it is they are actually talking to, tribes people, Indigenous people who are contributing to this edited collection from countries in Asia, countries in Africa, countries in Latin America, putting their voices about being at the sharp end of conservation, but also what a more socially just conservation might look like.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you so much for that, pal. And a big thank you to everyone that is listening. Remember, if you're helping the planet in any way at all, no matter how big or small, we love you, we appreciate you, and we hope you join us again next time. Take care, everyone.
Bye. We'd like to say a massive thank you to all of our supporters on Patreon, and a special shout out to our top tier patrons, Barbara Burke, Pierre Munt, Jill Burke, Jolyn Stone, Karen Taylor, Lizzie, Marie-Louise O'Hanrahan, and Steve Smith. Thank you so much for your support. If you'd like to join these amazing people and support the show, head to patreon.com/G&D Media UK. And if you can't afford to help us out, please leave us a review on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcast. Thank you so much.